Bryan Kohberger is serving for consecutive life sentences. The case is officially closed. But in January 2026, newly unsealed court documents revealed something that nobody in the mainstream media wants to talk about. 3 unidentified men's DNA was found at the crime scene. None of it belongs to Kohberger, and none of it was ever submitted to the FBI's national database to find a match. Why? And then there's the question that forensic experts can't stop asking. 150 stab wounds for victims, 2 floors in 9 minutes. Could one man really have done all of that? Before we go any further, if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel, I really appreciate it. And tell me in the comments right now, do you think Kohberger acted alone? Because what I'm about to show you might completely change your answer. Let's get into it. To understand why the accomplice theory is coming back in 2026, we need to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the investigation. The beginning of that night. November 13, 2022. Moscow, Idaho, a small college town in northern Idaho. Population 25,000, home to the University of Idaho. Rolling hills, quiet streets. The kind of place where people don't lock their doors. Where parents send their kids to college without a second thought. Moscow hadn't seen a murder in years. Until that night. The house was at 1122 King Road, a white 3-story rental home just blocks from campus. 6 students lived there. On the second floor, Madison Magan and Kaylee Gon, best friends since 6th grade, both 21 years old. They had just graduated and were planning to move to Austin, Texas together. They had already found jobs, already found an apartment. Their whole future was planned out. On the 3rd floor, Shauna Kernodle, 20 years old. She was dating Ethan Chapin, also 20. Ethan didn't live in the house, but he was staying over that night. And on the 1st floor, 2 other roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk. They would survive. November 12th was a Saturday night college town weekend party night. Kaylee and Madison went out to a local bar called the Corner Club. Security footage shows them there around 1:30 in the morning, laughing, dancing, having the time of their lives. Around 1:40 a.m. they left and walked to a food truck called the Grub Truck. More cameras caught them there, ordering carbonara pasta, talking with friends, completely relaxed. Just a normal college night. Around 1:56 a.m. they got a ride home. They arrived back at the King Road house just before 2 a.m. Shanna and Ethan had been at a fraternity party. They got home around 1:45 a.m. So by 2 o'clock in the morning, everyone was home. All 6 people in that house, all alive. And then, sometime between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m., someone entered through a sliding glass door on the 2nd floor that had been left unlocked, armed with a large fixed-blade knife. What happened next would become one of the most horrific crimes in Idaho history. The next morning, around 11:45 a.m., one of the surviving roommates called friends. She said someone in the house was unconscious and not waking up. Those friends rushed over. One of them called 911 at 11:58 a.m. when police arrived at noon. They found a scene so disturbing that officers required therapy afterward. Blood had soaked through the mattresses into the floor below. The coroner described it as the worst crime scene he had seen in 30 years of work for students. All dead in their beds: Kaylee Goncalves, 21 years old, Madison Magan, 21 years old, Shauna Kernodle, 20 years old, Ethan Chapin, 20 years old. All had been stabbed multiple times. Several had defensive wounds, meaning they fought back. They tried to survive. Moscow police immediately knew this was beyond their capability. They called Idaho State Police, then the FBI. By that afternoon, the house was surrounded by crime scene tape. News helicopters were circling overhead, and the community of Moscow went into absolute panic. Parents drove to campus to pull their kids out. Gun stores sold out of firearms within days. People who had never locked their doors were installing security systems overnight, because whoever did this was still out there. And here's where the story starts to get complicated in ways that the media never fully explained. When investigators processed the crime scene, forensic teams found something that would later become one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. A tan leather knife sheath, military style, found face down on the bed next to the bodies of Madison Magan and Kaylee Goncalves, partially under Madison's body and the comforter. The knife itself was gone. The killer had taken it. On the button snap of that sheath, forensic teams found male DNA, touch DNA, a tiny amount, microscopic, but enough. They ran it through CODIS, the national FBI DNA database. No match. They ran it through local databases. No match. So investigators turned to a newer technique, investigative genetic genealogy. The same method that caught the Golden State Killer in 2018. They uploaded the DNA profile to public genealogy databases and started building a family tree, tracing distant relatives, narrowing down possibilities week after week of painstaking work, and slowly, they closed in on one person. Bryan Christopher Kohberger, 28 years old, PhD student in criminology at Washington State University. WSU is in Pullman, Washington, 8 miles from Moscow, Idaho, a 10-minute drive. Bryan had moved to Pullman in August 2022 to begin his doctoral program. Before that, he had completed a master's degree in criminal justice in Pennsylvania. He had spent years studying crime, how criminals think, how they get caught. He had even posted online surveys asking people about their experiences committing crimes. Questions like, how did you choose your victim? What were you feeling at the time? Did you have any remorse? At the time, people thought it was academic research. Looking back now, it feels like something else entirely. When investigators started looking into Bryan Kohberger, everything started clicking into place. He owned a white Hyundai Elantra. Security cameras near the King Road house had captured a white sedan circling the neighborhood multiple times, between 2:45 a.m. and 4 a.m. on the night of the murders. His cell phone records showed he had been near the King Road house at least 12 separate times before the murders, always late at night, always driving past slowly. Investigators believe he was stalking the victims, watching them, planning. And on the night of November 13th, Bryan's phone data told a very specific story. His phone pinged cell towers near his apartment in Pullman until 2:47 a.m. Then it went dark, turned off or put on airplane mode. At 4:48 a.m., it came back online and showed movement south, away from Moscow, back toward Pullman. The murders happened during that exact window. But there was something else that investigators found that night, something that would become the foundation for everything that came after. One of the surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen, told police what she had seen. Dylan had been on the first floor. Around 4 a.m. she heard what she thought was Kaylee playing with her dog upstairs. Then she heard crying. Then she heard a male voice say something like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She opened her bedroom door slightly to look and she saw him, a figure dressed entirely in black, a mask covering his face, bushy eyebrows, athletic build, around 5'10" to 6 feet tall. He was walking toward the sliding glass door at the back of the house. He walked right past her door. He looked at her, and then he just left. Dylan stood there completely frozen. In total shock, she went back into her room, locked the door, and didn't come out. She didn't call 911, not for hours. Before you judge her for that, you need to understand something that most people get completely wrong. Dylan experienced what psychologists call tonic immobility, a freeze response to extreme trauma. When the human brain encounters terror beyond what it can process, it shuts down higher functions as a survival mechanism. You physically cannot move, you cannot think clearly. You just freeze. Dylan's brain didn't process murder. It processed intruder. Maybe a drunk person, maybe someone the girls had brought home. She was in shock, and that shock is a completely involuntary biological response. She is not to blame. On December 30th, 2022, 7 weeks after the murders, investigators made their move. Bryan had driven cross-country to his parents' home in Albrightville, Pennsylvania for the holidays. FBI agents and Pennsylvania State Police had been watching the house for days. At 3 a.m., a SWAT team surrounded the property. They arrested Bryan without incident. He didn't resist. When they searched his apartment back in Pullman, they found it had been deep cleaned, scrubbed thoroughly. When they searched his white Hyundai Elantra, same thing, vacuumed, wiped down, recently detailed, but investigators took samples anyway. And they took a DNA sample directly from Bryan, a cheek swab. They compared it to the DNA found on the knife sheath at the crime scene. It was a match. The statistical probability, 5.37 octillion times more likely to be his DNA than a random person's. That is a 5 followed by 27 zeros. Bryan Christopher Kohberger was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. If convicted, he faced the death penalty. But here's where the story takes a turn that most channels never covered. Because while the prosecution was building their case around Bryan Kohberger, his defense team was quietly uncovering something that nobody wanted to talk about. 3 other men's DNA had been found at the crime scene. Let that sink in for a moment. Not Kohberger's DNA. 3 completely different, completely unidentified males. 2 were found inside the house. 1 was found outside on a glove near the property. And here is the detail that legal analysts say is genuinely difficult to explain. None of that DNA was ever submitted to CODIS, the FBI's National Criminal Database. The same database investigators used when they first tested the knife sheath DNA. The same database that is the standard first step in any murder investigation. They found unknown male DNA at the scene of 4 murders, and they never tried to identify who those people were. Why? Defense attorney J. Weston Logsdon raised this directly in court filings. He pointed out that there was also a total lack of victim DNA found anywhere in Kohberger's apartment, his office, his home, or his vehicle. Not a single trace of the 4 victims was ever found anywhere associated with Bryan Kohberger. Think about that. 4 people were stabbed a combined 150 times. There would have been an enormous amount of blood, an enormous amount of biological material. And yet nothing connected to those 4 victims was ever found on Kohberger in his car or in his home, even after he had cleaned everything. Forensic experts say that level of cleanup, complete elimination of all victim DNA, would be extraordinarily difficult for one person alone. And then in January 2026, journalist Howard Blum, who had been covering this case since the very beginning and wrote a best-selling book about it, came forward with something he had been reluctant to say publicly. He believed Kohberger may not have acted alone. Blum was careful. He said clearly that he was not a conspiracy theorist, that he still believed Kohberger was involved in the killings, but he said the newly released evidence raised questions he could no longer ignore. The first question was the timeline. Police said the murders occurred between 4:07 a.m. and 4:20 a.m., 13 minutes. But Blum argued that 13 minutes was actually generous, because Kohberger also had to leave the house after the attacks, go up a hill, remove a bloody suit, and get back to his car, which means the actual window for the murders themselves may have been as short as 9 minutes. 9 minutes, 150 stab wounds. 4 victims, 2 different floors of the house. Could one man physically have done all of that alone? Dr. Brent Tarvey, the forensic criminologist hired by Kohberger's own defense team, reportedly reviewed the autopsy results and was prepared to argue in court that at least 2 suspects were involved in this attack. He wasn't arguing that Kohberger was innocent. He was arguing that Kohberger didn't do it alone. And then there is the detail that may be the most disturbing of all. On the night of Bryan Kohberger's arrest, as he was being taken out of his parents' home in zip ties and placed in the back of a state trooper's car, he said something, the very first words out of his mouth. He didn't ask about his parents. He didn't ask about his sister. He didn't ask why he was being arrested. He asked, was anyone else arrested? At the time, investigators noted it but didn't think much of it. They assumed he was asking about his family members. But now, after seeing everything that has come out in 2026, those 4 words carry a very different weight. Was anyone else arrested? Not who are you? Not what is this about? Not I didn't do anything. Was anyone else arrested? As if he already knew why they were there. And as if he expected someone else to be in handcuffs alongside him. Howard Blum said it directly in his reporting. Those words, in retrospect, raised the possibility that someone else is still out there right now. And then there's one more piece that nobody in the media has connected properly. Kohberger, before the murders, had posted an online research survey asking people about their experiences committing crimes, questions about how they chose their victims, how they approached crime scenes, what they felt before, during, and after. One theory that emerged in court documents suggested that through that survey Kohberger may have made contact with someone who was interested in more than just filling out a questionnaire, someone who shared his obsession. Could that survey have been how a partnership began? We don't know. And because Kohberger took a plea deal, we may never know. There was no trial, no testimony, no cross-examination, no public airing of the evidence that both sides had been building for 2.5 years. The prosecution got their guilty plea. The defense got the death penalty taken off the table. And the families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Morgan, Shanna Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were left with 4 life sentences and a mountain of unanswered questions. Legal analyst Andrea Burkhardt said it perfectly. The problem that has really haunted this case is the inability of that plea to give us real closure, to understand exactly what happened and why. And she went further. She pointed out that investigators never submitted the unknown male DNA samples to CODIS and called it incomprehensible. In her words, it's incomprehensible why police would not have pursued that lead, if only to be able to rule it out. So where does that leave us? Bryan Kohberger is behind bars. He will never leave prison. On that, the case is closed. But the question of whether he acted alone, whether someone else was in that house that night, whether someone else helped plan it, helped carry it out, helped cover it up, that question is not closed. 3 unidentified men's DNA at the scene. Never identified, never run through the national database. No victim DNA anywhere on Kohberger or in his belongings. 150 stab wounds in 9 to 13 minutes across 2 floors. A forensic criminologist prepared to testify that at least 2 people were involved. And the first words Bryan Kohberger said when he was arrested. Was anyone else arrested? The prosecution needed a conviction and they got one. But a conviction and the complete truth are not always the same thing. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Morgan, Shanna Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, they deserve to graduate, to start their careers, to fall in love, to build their lives. Instead, their lives were taken in 13 minutes on a cold November night in a small Idaho college town. And the full story of what happened in those 13 minutes may never fully be told. That's what makes this case impossible to walk away from. That's what makes this case matter. And that's what we'll keep covering here, because these 4 lives deserve more than a plea deal and a closed file. Thank you for watching. If this case affected you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and take care of the people around you. Until the next video.